Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quiet. The sound of your own breath as you lie still, a fan ticking in the corner, and the soft weight of a blanket settling around you like a second skin. You're safe, warm, tucked into the present. But tonight, we're wandering somewhere colder, not a battlefield or a royal court, just a field, dry, unremarkable, and unlucky because you're born here, on the wrong side of the road, the wrong side of the river, the wrong patch of earth with the wrong surname. And that's it, your fate's decided before your first tooth. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always comforting to know who else is out there drifting with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born under a low roof, the kind of roof that leaks when it rains and traps heat when it doesn't. Your father is a tenant farmer, or was, until his back gave out. Your mother still works, of course. Not that anyone calls it that, just chores, always chores. You don't know it yet, but the kid in the stone house across the lane, he'll learn Latin, you'll learn to sweep. Historians still argue whether rigid class systems were truly inescapable, or if rare cases of rags to riches prove otherwise. But here's the bedtime truth. Most people, most of the time, stayed exactly where they were born. Like moss on a rock, you cling, but you don't climb. You eat what's left after the good grain is sold. You sleep between cold walls, and if you're lucky, you die old. If not, it's a fever, or a horse's kick, or just bad luck, and the world, it moves on without you. Here's a fun one. In medieval England, your legal worth as a person was quantifiable. There was a literal price on your head. Your worgild. A noble's death might fetch a fortune, yours a few cows, maybe. Enough to annoy your landlord. But don't worry. At least you're not in ancient Sparta, where weak babies were, let's say, recycled early, or 17th century Qing China, where unwanted girl infants might simply disappear. Across history, your birth status decided your job, your clothes, your spouse, and your punishment. In parts of Europe, sumptuary laws meant only nobles could wear velvet or fur. You wool, scratchy, damp, and dyed with plants that smell suspiciously like pondweed. And yet somehow people carved out small lives. They told jokes, raised children, stole moments of beauty from brutal days. You help a neighbor rethatch their roof. You sneak extra berries into your sister's bowl. No one will write about it. No one will know your name. But the injustice is not that you're forgotten. The injustice is that someone else, across a boundary or a bloodline, is remembered purely by accident of birth. They dine under chandeliers. While you count the spoons, they have scribes. You have splinters. Even your language betrays you. Peasant becomes an insult, noble a compliment. And centuries later, when history is written, the pen slides right past your door. It's easy to romanticize the past. Sun-dappled fields, hearty stews, everyone singing around a fire. That's not untrue. People did find joy, but not because life was fair, because they had to. You, here under this cracked beam roof, don't know philosophy, but you know dignity. You've got calloused hands and a spine that won't quite bend to every order that counts. You know the tax collector by name, and he knows your best cow. You know the Lord's hunting dogs better than the Lord himself. And once, when the steward wasn't looking, you stole a moment alone in the manor's herb garden, just to smell something clean. There's a part of your life that isn't measured by land or law. It's in the lullaby you hum, the stew you stir, the names you whisper for the future. You won't be carved into marble, but someone, someday, might still walk the ground you walked. And maybe, just maybe, they'll wonder who lived here. They won't know your name, but they'll feel something in the soul. You don't write the story, but someone does. And they've already picked a favorite. Because here's the thing about history, it's not what happened. It's what got written down. And the people holding the pen, they were rarely the ones with dirt under their nails. You're not in the pages, you're in the margins if you're lucky. The first time you realize this is subtle, maybe you overhear a traveling priest reading aloud from a scroll. It's about a glorious king and his divine wisdom. You're there in the crowd, listening with a piglet tied to your belt and the sun to your back. The king built temples, conquered rivals, brought peace. Funny, you think. The year that peace started was also the year your neighbor's barn burned down in a tax riot. But that didn't make the scroll. Historians still argue whether the chroniclers of old truly believed in the righteousness of kings or were simply paid too well to say otherwise. Either way, the story is shaped, smooth, polished. You, the quiet farmer, the cautious rebel, the mother who smuggled grain under her cloak, that story is too complicated, too ordinary, so it disappears. The Roman Empire gives us marble busts, Latin inscriptions, and statues with ABS you could grate cheese on. But the average Roman, no bust, no statue, just the occasional shopping list scratched into a potsherd. We know the names of generals, not the soldiers who actually bled. We have epic poems about emperors, not the bureaucrats who filed tax records with ink-stained fingers and a permanent headache. And so the story tilts just a little, but enough. You start to notice it everywhere, how in every retelling. The ruler is wise, even when he's bankrupting the treasury to build a new mausoleum for his horse. The conquest is brilliant, even when it ends with villages in ash. The queen is beloved, even when her court is hemorrhaging coins and heads. And the rebels uncivilized, savage, barbaric. You watch as your people are described by what they lack. They didn't have writing. They didn't have pyramids. They didn't invent democracy, at least not in Greek. Therefore, they must not have mattered. A fun fact to take to bed. The Incas had no written alphabet, but they did have a system of knotted cords called quipus, basically spreadsheets made of string, complex, precise, entire census systems hung from braided wool. But early European explorers saw no books and assumed there was no history. It's like walking into someone's house, seeing no furniture, and deciding no one lives there. When you're standing in the kitchen, you lie awake at night, chewing on this, the idea that the story of the world is a patchwork quilt sewn by a very specific circle of hands. The kind of hands that don't get calluses, the kind that hold ink and ring signets, and maybe the occasional poisoned cup. And when things get ugly, when war or famine or the plague kicks in, the pen flicks to the next page, we don't dwell. We just say dark times and move along. Even you, reader of bedtime history might be doing it now, skimming, blinking slowly, thinking of sleep, the narrative so smooth it lulls. And that's part of the injustice, too, because when history is told like a fairy tale, the villains become background noise. The losses blur. The people like you regular, gentle, stubborn little sparks of humanity get flattened into statistics. You want an example? Take the conquest of the Americas. We have maps, names, grand dates, but the people who lived there, who farmed there, danced there, loved there, millions of voices evaporated, entire languages went quiet. And in the retelling, those cultures are often painted as obstacles, speed bumps, foils to a noble explorer's journey. It's like writing a cookbook where the only ingredient is the chef's ego. The pen is powerful. It turns failure into strategic withdrawal. It turns theft into acquisition. It turns people into props. And once it's written down, it sticks. Even today, textbooks cling to the idea of great men, leaders who shaped the world, as if the rest of us were wet clay just waiting for a sword or a signature. But here's the sleepy truth. The world was built by bakers, gardeners, seamstresses, midwives, storytellers, sailors, scribes by you, and people like you. They didn't get statues, they got calluses, and maybe a joke passed down like treasure. So next time you hear about the rise of an empire, pause, ask who it trampled on the way up, ask who wrote the tale, ask who it forgot, and then maybe hum a lullaby from the margins. By now you've probably noticed something else missing. Or rather, someone, where are the women? You blink, you shuffle through the dusty tomes, and it's mostly kings, not queens, philosophers, not daughters, priests, not midwives. Where are the hands that wove the linen, stirred the soup, delivered the children, brewed the beer, and yes, sometimes ruled with sharp minds sharper than any sword? History forgot them or chose to. And here's the twisty injustice. It's not that women didn't do remarkable things. It's that, for centuries, scribes and scholars didn't find those things remarkable enough. Mainstream historians still argue whether women in ancient Egypt had more legal rights than their counterparts in Greece or Rome. But one thing's clear, even in societies where women could own land, run businesses, or divorce, we rarely hear their names. Take Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Nana, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and arguably the world's first named author. She wrote hymns, prayers, and poems, some of which still survive. But how many bedtime history fans know her name over, say, Sargon's, or consider Wujiao, better known as Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own name? She was smart, ruthless, poetic. She used Buddhism like a sword and rule for decades, yet some traditional texts describe her as a usurper, a temptress, a tyrant, because a woman in power was already an offense. And then there are the women who didn't rule, didn't write, didn't war, but held entire communities together like thread through fabric. Midwives, for example. You'd think someone who helps bring life into the world would earn a footnote, but no, too domestic, too common. Never mind that in medieval Europe, midwives were often the ones with the most medical knowledge, especially when male doctors were still leeching people with bad humors and crossing their fingers. You probably won't find them in the textbooks, but you can find their shadows in folk recipes, in family superstitions. in that strange pouch your grandmother once told you never to open. Even queens get edited. Catherine de' Medici becomes a scheming poisoner. Eleanor of Aquitaine becomes a footnote between her husbands. And Boleyn becomes a necklace and a scandal. Women are remembered for how they looked, not what they built. Unless they were terrifying, then they become legends. See Boudica, the warrior queen who led a revolt against the Roman Empire after her daughters were assaulted and her kingdom stolen. The Romans eventually crushed her rebellion, of course, but her story survived mostly because she was angry enough, dramatic enough, to make it into the narrative. Which raises a sleepy question. How many Boudicas never raised a sword? How many women resisted not with armies, but with patience, with whispers, with quiet stubbornness that never made it to parchment? A fringe tidbit for your dreams. In 17th century Europe, widows were often the most powerful women in their communities. Why? Because they were finally free of husbands, free of fathers, free to own land, manage wealth, and speak in public. The price of power, in many cases, was a funeral. Even language betrays the bias. History itself comes from historia, Greek for inquiry, yes, but also deeply rooted in the masculine voice. No wonder history emerged in modern times as a kind of protest slogan. Cheeky, yes, but pointed. And it's not just women who vanish. Any group considered less than by the record keepers enslaved people, the poor or the colonized, are written about, not with observed, not heard. They become characters, not narrators. You, curling now under your blanket, start to wonder, who else got snipped out of the script? Because if history is a patchwork, women have been stitched into the lining, holding everything in place, invisible, until you look closely. So next time you hear a tale of a great man, pause, ask who raised him, who advised him, who rolled her eyes behind the curtain while he gave his big speech, because someone did. And while we're at it, give a little thanks to the anonymous woman who first figured out how to brew a perfect cup of tea, or delivered a baby under torchlight in a storm, or quietly translated holy texts into local dialects so her children could read. No statues, no parades, just quiet power. And tonight you remember her. So far, you've been quietly left out, forgotten by the pen, erased by the robe and the crown. But sometimes your story was very much present, just labeled as a problem. Because you didn't just live. Sometimes you fought back, and oh, how history hates a good uprising. Revolts real, messy, brave, inconvenient revolts have a way of vanishing from the official scrolls like smoke in moonlight. And when they do get mentioned, they're rarely told from the ground. Take the Haitian Revolution, one of the most successful slave uprisings in human history. It toppled an entire colonial regime and gave birth to the first black republic. The people who did that weren't generals. They were enslaved workers, farmers, runaways, survivors. But for years, Western textbooks barely whispered about it. Too uncomfortable, too disruptive, too equal. Historians still argue whether this silence was deliberate erasure or just a symptom of Eurocentric scholarship. Either way, the result's the same. Entire generations grew up thinking liberty only came in powdered wigs and musket duels, not machetes and barefoot marches. And that's just the flashy stuff. The truth is, most resistance didn't look like war. It looked like refusing to bow, refusing to marry the man chosen for you, teaching your children your real language in secret, hiding food, passing notes, planting seeds from home soil. You didn't need an army, just a will. Take the Zanj rebellion in 9th century Iraq. Tens of thousands of East African slaves rose up against the Abbasid Caliphate. They captured cities. They held territory for over a decade. And yet, if you blink, you'll miss them in the history books, reduced to a footnote, a disturbance. Or the Mapuche of Chile, who resisted Spanish conquest for over 300 years. That's not a blip, that's stamina. But when you hear Spanish conquest, it's usually conquistadors in gleaming armor and big hats, not the Mapuche burning outposts and outwitting cavalry. Why? Because history prefers a neat narrative. Heroes and villains, order restored, a crown back on the right head, but the people who resist are messy. They blur the lines, they complicate the endings, so they get rewritten as criminals or worse ignored. Here's a softer, sleepier injustice. In many cases, we only know revolts happened at all because of the punishments that followed. Not the voices of the rebels, not their reasons, just the list of names hung or tortured or fined. It's like hearing the echo without the shout. A fringe fact for your pillow. In the 14th century, female textile workers in Ghent organized what may have been one of the earliest labor strikes. They wanted fair pay. The city records simply note a disruption in production. No names, no speeches, just silence with the volume burned down. And then there's the irony how some revolts only get celebrated after they've cooled off. Centuries later, statues go up for the same rebels who were once hunted like wolves. You ever think about that the very act of rebellion, once condemned, becomes heritage? That today's outlaw is tomorrow's bronze hero. But what about the ones who didn't win? What about the slave who ran and was caught? The woman who refused the arranged marriage and was locked away? The miner who threw a stone and missed? Their stories didn't end with a speech. They ended with a cell or silence, and still they resisted. You walk through history's halls and notice that the quietest rooms feel the most alive. Not the throne room, not the war council, but the servants' quarters, the alley, the hidden door and the cellar, because that's where resistance lived. Not always in fire, sometimes just in breath. So when you dream tonight, dream of those who stood up and sat down hard, who scratched a name into a prison wall, who stole back an hour of rest, who taught their children stories the empire couldn't translate. History may forget them, but your memory won't. You wake to the smell of ink and metal. Something's being built, or rather, has been built, and someone else is about to take the credit. You've stepped into the long, silent hall of stolen ideas. You see, history has a habit of assigning genius to the most convenient candidate, usually someone wealthy, educated, and already quoted 3 times by page 10. But the real inventors, the people tinkering in corners, patching machines with hairpins, solving math problems in coal dust on the floor, they vanish. Invisible geniuses all around you. Let's start with a name you might not know. Ibn al-Haytham, an Arab scholar from the 10th century who essentially laid the foundations for the scientific method and optics centuries before Europe caught on. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance rediscovered knowledge like his or simply rebranded it in fancier Latin. Meanwhile, you've probably heard of Galileo. Same goes for Mary Anning, a working-class fossil hunter in early 1800s England. She discovered ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, while men in top hats published the papers. For years, museum plaques left her out. One Victorian geologist even called her an industrious girl of no consequence. That industrious girl read through Earth's prehistoric timeline with a hammer. But if your name isn't on the title page, did you really matter? Take the printing press. You've heard of Gutenberg, no doubt. But in Korea, movable metal type A existed nearly 2 centuries earlier. In China, even earlier still, yet the narrative credits the German. The West gets invention, the East gets influence. Or how about the development of calculus? Newton and Leibniz were the headline act. But earlier Islamic mathematicians like Al-Tusi laid groundwork in motion and infinitesimals, forgotten footnotes, now crumpled under centuries of Eurocentric footfall. You shift in your blanket, feel a twinge of injustice creep beneath your pillow, and then there's the matter of credit stolen not just by accident, but on purpose. Women in science were often pushed behind their male colleagues, sometimes literally. Rosalind Franklin captured the famous X-ray image of DNA. Watson and Crick published the model. She died before they gave her a footnote. Nikola Tesla's wireless energy, eclipsed by Edison's PR machine. Granville T. Woods, a black inventor who improved railway safety systems, had to fight Edison in court just to prove he existed professionally, a fringe tidbit. Hedy Lamarr, Hollywood starlet, silk gown, red lipstick, also co-invented a frequency-hopping radio system to prevent torpedo interference in World War II. But no one took her seriously until decades later, when her tech formed the basis for Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Imagine inventing the future while being asked to smile more. And all along, you're there. You, the quiet builder, the experimental cook, the monk drawing marginalia in a cold scriptorium, the enslaved man turning gears behind a cotton gin, the artisan repairing a compass at sea with only brass wire and spit. You didn't get a statue, you got a shrug. Historians still debate whether erasure like this was deliberate sabotage or just systemic bias, an ocean of oversight that conveniently drowns the wrong names. Either way, the pattern repeats. The face of innovation is battered and privileged. The hands of innovation are cracked and callous. And here's where it stings. The theft doesn't stop at the moment of invention. It ripples forward. Schools teach one name, not 10. Textbooks simplify, museums canonize, and you tucked under your blanket, listening in the dark, start to believe that's just how it was. It wasn't. Some of the most useful things in your home, the paper, the clock, the toothbrush, the pasta, weren't invented by any one person. They evolved through necessity, through thousands of tiny adjustments made by people who didn't keep journals or patent. Lawyers, a wooden spoon passed down, a wheel reshaped, a die improved, a formula scribbled on a leaf and lost. It's not that there were no geniuses. It's that genius never came with a specific haircut and mailing address. So tonight, rest your head on that thought that for every name we remember, there are 10,000 whispered in kitchens and workshops whose brilliance was buried in footnotes, if not entirely left out. Let the silence be full of them. You step outside now, still barefoot, still unseen. But this time the injustice isn't a whisper, it's a map, because someone drew a line and everything changed. It's hard to sleep when the borders keep shifting under your feet. You don't know it yet, but that stream where your grandmother washed rice, it's now a national boundary. The orchard your cousin planted belongs to a foreign government. The town across the hill where your sister married, enemy territory, and the man who made that decision never once set foot here. Welcome to the quiet violence of cartography. The way the world is divided today, right now, has everything to do with a series of conversations you were never invited to. Paris, Berlin, London, maybe Vienna if someone brought biscuits. Historians still argue whether colonial borders were drawn out of ignorance or pure convenience. Some say it was practical, others call it what it was, chaos in cursive. Take Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 chop it up like a poorly sliced cake. No Africans were invited. No ethnic boundaries were respected. One moment you're part of a trading alliance with your neighbors. The next, you're a British subject and they're French, and both of you now need papers to cross a river your great-grandfathers fished in together. Or think of the Middle East, arbitrary lines carved after World War I, slicing through tribes, families, and trade routes that had existed for centuries. The Sykes-Picot Agreement wasn't just a geopolitical document. It was a set of assumptions sealed in ink that millions would live and die by. But it's not just colonial lines. Even today, border disputes still simmer in places where history was inked too hastily. And what happens when that ink hits lives? You wake up on the wrong side. Suddenly, your accent is suspicious. Your religion is threatening. Your passport is denied. Your land, once home, becomes disputed or worse. Vacant in India, families found themselves split overnight by petition. One train ride turned neighbors into refugees. The lines were drawn so fast. Entire villages didn't realize they'd changed countries until soldiers knocked on the door. In Korea, the 38th parallel sliced a nation in half. Families wrote letters across the DMZ like messages to the moon. In Palestine, in Kurdistan, in Sudan, in countless unnamed valleys and plains, borders remain more real on paper than they are on land. And that's the cruelty. You don't see a dotted line when you walk through a grove. But the world says you cross something unforgivable. Here's a fringe tidbit for your pillow. In the Alps, there's a mountain hut that sits precisely on the border of Switzerland and Italy, depending on which room you sleep in. You're in a different country. It's a fun tourist gimmick. But imagine if your entire life, your family, your work, your safety depended on which room you were assigned. Maps lie sometimes, or at least they simplify. They pretend space is tidy, that people fit into neat shapes. But people don't. They drift, they migrate, they love across borders. They trade across fences, they survive. And when borders bring war, or poverty, or exile, history too often reduces the story to unrest. You are not unrest, you're just someone whose homeland got renamed without asking. The injustice is that you didn't move. The line did. You still plant the same seeds, speak the same lullabies, burn the same incense. But now you're considered other, and then, just to twist a knife, history books label your resistance as rebellion. Your grief becomes instability. Your journey becomes illegal, even when you're walking the same path your grandmother did. And for what? So that men in suits could balance power, redraw markets, test ideologies like new shoes. You lie back now. Let the map fade. Let the imaginary borders crumble. Imagine the land as it once was. Open, human, crisscrossed not by borders, but by stories, trade routes, wedding songs, borrowed spices. No passports, just pathways. Let that image lull you for a while. And when the world redraws itself tomorrow, remember, a map is not a memory. A border is not a birthplace. A nation is not a home. You are more than the lines someone else drew beneath your feet. You're walking again. The road is dusty, the sun low, and there's a man ahead. His hands are stained red, his eyes heavy, his robe worn and patched. Not from war, but from work. You don't know his name. History didn't think it was important. He's an executioner, and tonight we finally look at the man who swung the sword, lit the pyre, tightened the noose and paid for it in silence. Because someone always did the killing, but no one wanted to remember who. Executioners have existed in almost every society tasked with maintaining order, but banished from community, from comfort, from ordinary life. You want a strange bedtime thought. In medieval Germany, the local hangman often had to live outside the city walls alone. No baker would sell to him. No priest would marry him. And yet, when the town needed justice, they knocked on his door. Historians still argue whether this exile was born from fear or guilt. But the result was the same: isolation. Even in death, these men weren't welcome. In some regions, executioners had their own cemeteries, and blessed and marked, just in case the rest of the dead got offended. And it wasn't just Europe. In Japan, members of the Burakumin caste who did impure jobs like butchering, tanning, or executions were systematically excluded for centuries. You could inherit discrimination like a family recipe. In India, too, caste determined who could kill, clean, or touch the dead. You could live your whole life doing society's darkest labor and still be spat on in the street. And what about the ones who didn't swing a blade but still bore the guilt? The plague doctor who burned a house down to stop infection. The prison cook who served a condemned man's last meal. The clerk who signed the order, jobs with heavy consequences but no thanks. A fringe tidbit. In 19th century France, the famous executioner Charles Henry Sanson executed over 30 people, including King Louis XVI. He kept journals where he described the shaking hands, the prayers, the blood. But he also recorded his shame, his regret, the loneliness of being the instrument of law, but never its author. Imagine killing a king for a republic that still wouldn't shake your hand. You begin to notice a pattern. The people with the hardest jobs are often the easiest to discard. We romanticize the warrior, but shun the butcher. We honor the judge, but exile the hangman. We want justice, but we don't want to see it happen. So we create distance. We call them necessary evils. We invent masks, literal and metaphorical. The hooded executioner, the silent soldier, the bureaucrat behind the curtain, because if we see their face too clearly, we might see our own reflection. It's not always about punishment, either. In ancient Rome, death sentences were sometimes carried out by enslaved gladiators. A double injustice forced to kill to survive, then punished for surviving. And still, someone had to do it. In the Ottoman Empire, the Bostan guards, who also carried out executions, were chosen from among the most trusted servants. They killed with silk cords, so there'd be no blood, clean, invisible. History likes things clean. You imagine now what it feels like to be him, the man in the robe, kneeling in the grass after the crowd has gone, washing the blade in a quiet stream, wondering what's left of himself when the work is done. He's not a villain, he's not a hero. He's a function, a tool, and he's tired. His children are afraid of him, his neighbors avoid him. His name, if it's remembered at all, is spoken with a shiver. But without him, the justice system collapses. Without someone to turn orders into action, the law is just ink on paper. He carries out the punishment society demands and becomes society's scapegoat for it. The injustice isn't just what he does. It's how quickly everyone else forgets they asked him to do it. And you might have known someone like him. Maybe you even were someone like him. Not by choice, but by need. And maybe, just maybe, you did what you had to do and prayed no one would ever write it down. But tonight, in this quiet space between dreams, someone does. Not to praise, not to condemn, you're still in the shadows now, but the silence feels different, heavier. You can hear chanting in the distance, bells chiming, incense curling through the air like questions no one once answered. You've entered the space where faith meets power, where the divine gets legal and the law gets very, very personal. Because tonight, the injustice is this: belief used as a weapon. You probably know the big moments, crusades, inquisitions, holy wars. But those are the dramatic headlines. Most of the harm happened in whispers, in villages, in courtrooms, in bedrooms, and it almost always started with a simple rule: your God must look like ours. Across centuries and continents, belief systems were used not just to inspire, but to divide. One prayer wrong, you're a heretic. One ritual too early, you're cursed. One ancestor out of place, you're out of time and out of luck. Historians still argue whether the medieval witch hunts in Europe were truly about religion or just a convenient way to control land, women, and fear. But whether the church believed it or not, the people did, and belief has a way of making executioners sleep better. You, lying low in your cottage, hear the rumors first: the cow that won't give milk, the baby born with a mark, the storm that hits after harvest, and then someone says your name. Not because you're wicked, but because you live alone, or because your herbs work better than the priest's prayers, or because your eyes are the wrong color in the wrong season. Soon you're standing barefoot in front of a tribunal, and the questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to break you. The injustice of religious law is that it's often disguised as morality, but delivered like punishment. It wasn't just witches. In Al-Andalus, when Christian forces retook Spain, Muslims and Jews who had lived there peacefully for centuries were forced to convert or flee. Some stayed and became conversos, Christian in public, but Jewish or Muslim in secret. If discovered, their punishment was not just exile, it was flames. And across the ocean, indigenous beliefs were buried literally under mission bells and church floors, whole cosmologies wiped clean by sermons and soldiers. Here's a fringe tidbit. In 17th century Japan, Suspected, Christians were forced to step on images of Christ to prove their loyalty to the shogunate. Refuse, and you could be tortured or executed. The test was called fumii. It wasn't about faith. It was about obedience. Obedience dressed as piety. Devotion turned into a ledger. Even in the Islamic empires, where many religions coexisted for periods of time, tolerance came with taxes, restrictions, and second-class status. You could believe so long as you paid for the privilege. And if you step out of line, well, belief suddenly became a national security issue. You realize now, walking through this stretch of history, that religion has often acted like a border, defining who belongs, who's safe, and who will be remembered kindly. Those who didn't conform weren't just outcast. They were rewritten. Pagan gods became demons. Matriarchal symbols turned monstrous. Rituals were rebranded as superstition, and if that wasn't enough, even sacred texts were adjusted. Translations shifted meaning, edits were made, and suddenly the divine started sounding an awful lot like whoever held the crown. You, dear dreamer, might have once whispered prayers to a tree or left offerings by a river, or watched stars for guidance your people followed for millennia, and then one day a stranger arrived and called it blasphemy. Your gods didn't change, the power did. Even now, in the bedtime quiet of the present, people still face persecution for what they wear, what they don't eat, who they marry, or how they pray. The modern world likes to believe it's outgrown these cruelties, but belief doesn't die. It mutates. It slips into law, into policy, into school books. The injustice isn't just about faith. It's about control, about using the sacred to silence. And what of the ones who truly believed deeply, quietly, radically, the mystics, the healers, the visionaries who heard voices not written in doctrine? They were often the first to be punished, the last to be remembered. You wonder now, curled under the weight of it all, how many miracles were erased because they didn't come with paperwork. So tonight, remember this: belief is not the enemy. Only when it's weaponized, cage, soul like truth in uniform. Let your final thought for this section be soft. Picture a temple lit by moonlight, a prayer whispered in a language no empire ever conquered, a ritual that doesn't ask for obedience, only for stillness. You don't need anyone's permission to believe. You're in a marketplace now, the smell of spices and sweat rising around you. You hear coins clink, a mule bray, the soft rhythm of sandals on packed earth. Someone sells dates, someone else sharpens a blade, and behind a wooden stall a man sells people, not in secret, not in shame, just business. Tonight's injustice isn't loud, it's ordinary. And that's what makes it so horrifying, because slavery wasn't always chains and whips. Often it was contracts, debts, polite society, and it wasn't ancient. It was everywhere. Historians still argue whether ancient slavery should be compared to transatlantic slavery, whether brutality has degrees, whether coerced labor with different rules counts as better. But in the quiet corners of the past, the real question is simpler. What does it feel like to live a life that legally belongs to someone else? Maybe you're born into it, like in ancient Athens, where a third of the population were enslaved, or Rome, where skilled enslaved people were prized teachers, doctors, accountants, educated, yet owned. You serve your master's children and teach them to read, but you can't marry freely. You help a sick patient recover, but you can't walk alone after sundown. You're brilliant, but your brilliance is someone else's property, a fringe tidbit. In ancient China, some enslaved individuals were used as human footstools for high-ranking officials. not metaphorically, literally. They'd kneel, and officials would rest their legs across their backs. Now, picture that as your job title. Slavery took different shapes. In the Islamic world, enslaved soldiers, mamluks, could rise to positions of great power. Some even became sultans, but that doesn't erase their beginnings, bought, owned, made to earn humanity inch by inch. In the Americas, of course, the cruelty became industrial. Millions ripped from West Africa, packed into ships so tightly some died standing. Their names lost, their stories vanished except in fragments of oral memory. Plantation slavery wasn't just labor, it was reproduction. Your children were assets, your body a factory, and if you resisted, brutality. If you didn't, erasure. You work, you survive, you get nothing. And what about debt slavery? You didn't break the law, you just borrowed money during a bad harvest. Now your son belongs to a merchant in town, and your daughter scrubs floors in a stranger's home. Even today, echoes remain. Modern forced labor, human trafficking, systems that trap people in jobs they can't leave because the law says technically they agreed. The injustice isn't just the pain, it's the logic that supports it. Laws were written to make it feel normal. Sacred texts were interpreted to justify it. Philosophers reasoned it was natural. Aristotle argued some people were slaves by nature. Others said it was divine punishment, or a civilizing mission, or economic necessity. And then, like a magician's sleight of hand, whole societies forgot it happened. We teach the abolition of slavery like a final chapter, the end, victory, celebration. But not every enslaved person was freed. Not every system collapsed. And even those who were freed were left with nothing, no land, no pay, no apology. Imagine working your whole life under a master, then being told you're free. Good luck. And when former slaves rose up, asked for land, for dignity, for recognition, the world called them ungrateful. You want a bedtime number? In the U.S., slaveholders were compensated for their losses after emancipation. The formerly enslaved receive nothing. Even when you die, the injustice clings. Slave cemeteries often went unmarked. Names were lost, generations reduced to inventory records and auction notices. But if you look closely, you'll find resistance hidden in plain sight, a song passed down with a double meaning. Because even in bondage, people dreamed, fell in love, told stories, hid seeds in their hair, hoping to plant something free in new soul. So tonight, as you lie still, think of the enslaved person who carved a pattern into a wooden spoon, who etched initials into a barn beam, who traced a secret map in ashes on a floor. They knew they might never be remembered, so they left tiny clues for the future. You found one. You hear a gavel, a bell, then silence. You're standing in a stone hall, not cold, echoing, self-important. It smells like ink, sweat, and the stale breath of men who've decided things. Behind a long table, someone in robes says your name. Not kindly, you've entered the courtroom. But don't expect justice here tonight. We look at how power dressed itself in rules and still bet them as it please. Because every empire, kingdom, republic, and chiefdom eventually needed something that looked like law. The illusion that everything, every execution, every exile, every punishment had reasons. But reasons can be rewritten, evidence ignored, and fairness often reserved for the few who could afford it. Historians still argue whether ancient legal codes like Hammurabi's were truly progressive or just early propaganda. Sure, there were rules, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but not all eyes were equal. If a nobleman blinded a poor man, he might pay a fine. If it happened in reverse, that poor man might lose more than an eye, and so it began. The long tradition of law as performance. Take medieval trials. You might have heard of trial by ordeal. Stick your arm in boiling water. If it heals clean, you're innocent. Sink in a lake, and you're guilty, but at least you're wet and proven wrong, or trial by combat. Nothing says fairness like whoever wins the sword fight was telling the truth. These methods weren't just random cruelty. They were meant to reflect divine will, but divine will often favored the strong, the rich, and those with shinier swords. And even when laws did offer rights, they came with fine print. In ancient Athens, a free male citizen could vote. His enslaved neighbor, his wife, his goat. Not so much. Rome had elaborate legal codes, but if you weren't a citizen, you didn't count, and women, again, were legal minors. Grown adults, legally children, a fringe tidbit. In some parts of early modern Europe, animals were put on trial. Pigs, rats, even insects, full trials with defense lawyers, verdicts, sometimes executions. It was less about pigs and more about pretending law applied to everything when really it just needed to feel sacred. Fast forward to the witch hunts, entire towns driven to madness by fear, envy, and a bit of bad bread. Seriously, ergot poisoning may have played a role. Accusations based on dreams and gossip, on the fact that you owned a black cat and didn't like church. And once the trial began, there was no winning. Confess, and you're a witch. Deny it. And that's exactly what a witch would say. Injustice wasn't an accident, it was baked in. Even in modern courtrooms, the scales are rarely balanced. Who speaks the right language? Who can afford the better lawyer? Who gets bail? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? You learn quickly that justice wears a costume. The powdered wigs, the robes, the Latin phrases, the ritual. But the ritual isn't the problem. It's that the ritual only protects some. The powerful have always known how to make the law work for them. Rewrite it, delay it, bury it in loopholes, or just ignore it altogether. Consider colonial law. Colonizers often created two sets of rules, one for themselves and one for the people they ruled. In British-controlled Kenya, for instance, native Kenyans could be arrested for loitering, for walking at night, for insulting an officer. The definition of insult was ... flexible, or parte tira. South Africa, where black citizens had to carry passbooks and could be jailed for simply being in the wrong part of town. Even in the U.S., laws once made it illegal for Native Americans to practice their religions, speak their languages, or even leave reservations without permission. You start to notice something uncomfortable. Laws often arrive not to protect, but to restrict. They define who can vote, who can marry, who can inherit, who can speak. And then they act surprised when those left out try to push back. But even in the bleakest courts, people resisted. Lawyers smuggled in arguments. Defendants refused to bow. Entire communities organized legal defenses, demanded rights, rewrote codes. Law became not just a weapon of power but a battlefield for change. Remember Rosa Parks? Her quiet act on a bus wasn't just moral, it was legal. Her arrest sparked a case, a precedent, a crack in the wall. And yet, for every famous case there are thousands forgotten. Trials where the innocent never walked free, where the guilty walked to free, where your name was mispronounced and your evidence lost, where the judge had already decided by lunch. So tonight, think of those who stood in that cold courtroom without a voice, who were told the law would protect them, then watched it turn away. And if you ever hear someone say justice was served, ask who got to eat. The air grows quiet, now not because the world is still, but because it's been forgotten. You're walking through a place with no statues, no plaques, no page in any history book. The grass grows wild, the names are gone, the people erased not by fire or sword, but by boredom. Tonight's injustice being deemed uninteresting. History remembers warlords, emperors, conquerors, but what about a nation that never conquered anyone? A people who made no enemies? A city that thrived for centuries without once invading a neighbor? Too peaceful, too remote, too hard to pronounce, so they're left out. Historians still argue whether this bias is deliberate or just a symptom of how records are preserved. Conquest writes louder than consensus. Victories leave more monuments than cooperation. But in the end, the result is silence. Take Great Zimbabwe, once a thriving African city of stone towers and elaborate trade. It was so impressive that early European explorers refused to believe it had been built by Africans. So they wrote another story, one with white hands and colonial ego. Only later, begrudgingly, did scholars admit the truth. The ancestors of the Shona people built it. No aliens, no invaders, just skill, patience, and pride. But how many other cities are still whispered about in footnotes, like Nonmadel in Micronesian island, city built atop a coral reef with basalt columns, so heavy we still don't know exactly how they moved them. Or the Mississippian mountain cities of North America, full of ceremonial structures, sophisticated trade, and complex society reduced in most textbooks to a paragraph about prehistoric tribes, or the Khmer road systems in Cambodia paved, elevated, and draining floodwaters with precision we only just mapped from satellites. Yet all these accomplishments fade under the shadow of empires that built taller walls and better stories. You're starting to see the pattern. A culture doesn't need to collapse to disappear from history. It only needs to be unwritten. No one burns the scroll. They just never copy it. A fringe tidbit for your dreams. The kingdom of Benin modern-day Nigeria was so artistically advanced that its bronze sculptures were mistaken for Renaissance era works. British soldiers looted them in the 19th century. Today they sit in European museums. The kingdom, still struggling to reclaim its legacy. That's the double blow, erasure followed by theft. And it doesn't stop with artifacts. Languages, too, vanish. The stories of an entire people fade when their tongue is silenced. In some cases, deliberately so by colonial policies, forced schooling, migration, in other cases, through neglect, because no one bothered to write them down. You wonder now, how many lullabies, proverbs, sacred chants, love poems, and recipes were never recorded because the people who sang them didn't have paper, or weren't taught to write. And if they were, would anyone have listened? This is the quiet injustice. The cultures that fed no empires, who painted no blood across their borders, who lived, traded, worshipped, raised children, and died just like everyone else but didn't make the cut because they didn't conquer, because they didn't matter, because their story wasn't convenient. Even now, textbooks are organized by empire: Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Mongol, British. The margins where the rest of the world lived get summarized. Entire continents become afterthoughts. Africa, a dark continent; Oceania, isolated islands; South America, the place before Columbus arrived, as if no one lived there, as if they were waiting to be discovered. They weren't. They were busy writing their own stories until someone else erased them. You look up now into the stars. Some of those people charted the heavens better than Europe ever did. Some sailed farther, farmed smarter, prayed with more grace. But we measure importance by influence, and influence by who ended up with the pen. So tonight you light a small lantern in your mind for every forgotten nation, for the lost libraries of Timbuktu, for the ruined palaces of Hazaribagh, for the stories told in bark, cloth, beadwork, sand drawings, and spiral tattoos. Just because they weren't carved in marble doesn't mean they didn't last, and just because no one wrote them down doesn't mean they never mattered. You wake with a cough, a chill, the distant toll of a bell. Not the kind that marks time, but the kind that warns of death. Tonight we drift through a long, uncomfortable history, where illness didn't just make you sick, it made you guilty. Because for centuries, if you fell ill, it wasn't just bad luck. It was your fault, your sin, your curse. And that's the injustice: how often society confused disease with punishment. Imagine you wake up in a medieval town with a rash on your arm. That's it. That's your crime. Neighbors pull away. The local priest avoids your eyes. Suddenly you're not just unwell, you're unclean. Historians still argue whether the concept of miasma, bad air causing illness, was a rational step forward or a dangerous superstition. Either way, the result was often the same: isolation, blame, and a whole lot of herbs stuffed into beak-shaped masks. The Black Death, terrifying, yes, but also revealing. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Foreigners were hunted. Sinners were whipped in public to atone for everyone's illness. The sick were sometimes boarded up in their homes, still alive, still begging. Disease brought death, but it also brought scapegoats. In leper colonies, people lost more than their health. They lost their names, their legal rights, their families, a fun bedtime detail. In some towns, lepers had to ring bells as they walked to warn others, like an apology in sound, and don't assume modernity saved us. In 19th century London, during cholera outbreaks, the poor were blamed for their own suffering, dirty habits, immoral lives. Meanwhile, the water pumps remained contaminated, ignored by officials in clean coats. Tuberculosis, once called consumption, was romanticized when it afflicted the upper class, seen as a disease of poets and tragic heroines. But when it hit the working class, it was filth disease. Blame shifted with wealth. Even in the 20th century, during the early days of the AIDS epidemic, victims were vilified. Entire communities, especially queer ones, were treated as walking contagions, not people. Funerals went unattended, wards were shunned, families severed. The virus didn't judge, society did. A fringe tidbit: in ancient Mesopotamia, doctors were often priests, and illness was diagnosed with divination, chicken livers, star charts, dreams. A headache could mean you insulted a god. A fever, Maybe you looked at the wrong person on a holy day, and once you were labeled impure, good luck shaking it. Sick women, in particular, had it worse: hysteria, melancholia, womb wandering so many ways to diagnose what was usually just exhaustion, trauma, or grief. Women with epilepsy were sometimes thought to be possessed. Men with depression were told to toughen up. Children with disabilities were hidden or worse. And what of the healers, herbalists, midwives, folk doctors? Too accurate, too intuitive, too inconvenient, often labeled witches or frauds. Too many successful cures, and suddenly the local clergy got nervous. After all, if you could heal someone without prayers or coins, what power did that suggest? And so, once again, society punished not just the ill, but those who tried to help. We like to think science changed all that. And yes, germ theory helped. Vaccines helped. Washing hands, thank you, Semmelweis helped. But stigma, that stayed longer, even now. People with chronic illness are told it's in their head. Disabled folks are treated as burdens instead of citizens. Mental illness is whispered about like a secret sin. The injustice tonight is the weight of blame laid on bodies already in pain. And you lying there, listening, might know that weight. Maybe you've carried it, or watched someone you love carry it. You're not alone. For every plague, every pandemic, every disease history remembers, there were countless small acts of care it forgot. A neighbor slipping broth through a crack in the door, a nurse who stayed a little longer, a mother who hummed through her mask. So tonight, remember this: illness is not a punishment, disability is not failure, and no one deserves to be erased because their body couldn't keep up with the world's cruel demands. You're more than your diagnosis, and far, far more than someone else's fear. You're walking through a quiet field now, wildflowers brushing your ankles, the hush of wind carrying something heavier than sound. Names that never made it into books, because tonight we search for the ones who never got to grow up, the lost children of history. You won't find them in timelines. There are no biographies, no recorded speeches or famous descendants, but they were there in foundling homes, in street gutters, in the shadows of noble houses, and they were everywhere. Historians still argue whether infant mortality rates in ancient and medieval times should change how we understand childhood itself. Some claim parents didn't bond with their children, knowing many would die. Others point to lullabies tossed and prayers carved into cradles. But whether you were cherished or not, one fact stayed cruel. Being a child in history was often a perilous thing. Let's begin with the unwanted. In ancient Rome, exposure was common. Unwanted infants, especially girls, were left outside the city gates. Sometimes they were taken in, sometimes not. Sometimes they were taken in and enslaved. In feudal Japan, a similar practice called mabiki, thinning out, allowed families, often out of desperation, to end a baby's life to preserve the others. It wasn't malice, it was scarcity, but the result was the same: erasure. Even in 19th century Europe, where morality and manners were beginning to sharpen, thousands of babies were abandoned at church doors or turned over to foundling hospitals. Some lived, most didn't. A fringe tidbit for your pillow. In Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti took in infants by the thousands. Each was left with a token half a cone, a swatch of fabric, a carved bead mitt to reunite them with their families one day. Most of those tokens were never claimed. Now think of the children who were kept but worked. In Victorian England, little fingers were prized in textile mills and chimney sweeps. Children were cheaper, more obedient, and if they got hurt, well, there were more where they came from. The child labor laws you might take for granted today, recent hard-won, fought for in ink, blood, and factory soot. In colonies, it was often worse. Indigenous children across Canada, Australia, and the U.S. were taken from their families and forced into boarding schools. They were civilized, stripped of language, tradition, even their names. Some were never seen again. Graves are still being found. The injustice wasn't just the abuse. It was the pretense that it was helpful. Imagine being told your heritage is a stain, that your ancestors were wrong, that your real name isn't suitable for paperwork. Children have always been easy targets, powerless, voiceless, too small to write their own defense. Even royalty weren't safe. History is full of lost princes, mysterious disappearances, convenient diseases. When a child threatened succession, the solution was often silence. And then there were the street kids, orphans, runaways, pickpockets, some fictionalized like Dickens' Oliver Twist, others simply swept away. In cities from Edo to Paris to Lagos, children formed invisible classes, gangs found families, or just vanished, buried in mass graves identified by nothing but a number. Even in times of peace, children were often treated more like property than people. Marriages arranged before their first tooth. Labor assigned as soon as they could stand, and if you broke the rules, well, many societies had jails for children, whipping posts, reform schools, moral correction. You wonder now, how many lives were shaped by punishments they never understood? You might think history, at least, would soften. Remember them kindly, but no, most of the time, it doesn't remember at all, because children don't leave behind great speeches or royal decrees. They leave behind tiny shoes, faded drawings, bones too small for a proper epitaph. But in the quiet, you can almost hear them, a skipped stone, a song hummed behind a stable, a question asked and never answered. The injustice isn't just that these children die, or were hurt, or were used. It's that their stories were deemed too small to record. But tonight you make space for the girl who worked until her fingers bled, for the boy who wandered off and never came back, for the siblings who whispered in a strange new school, holding hands so tightly they bruised, for all the children who didn't get to grow into their names. You remember them, not for their tragedy, but for the fact that they were here, and for a moment they are again. There's a hush tonight, not the silence of defeat, but of endurance. You're walking down a narrow path, half-lit, pressed between stone walls and secrets. Nothing flashy, no flags, no famous last stands, just footsteps. Quiet, persistent, and yielding. You're among the ones who resisted in ways history barely noticed. Not all defiance is a battle cry. Some of it looks like gardening ... Tonight, we're with the people who said no without saying anything at all. They didn't storm the palace. They planted bitter herbs in forbidden soil. They wore the old patterns under their uniforms. They gave their children names that would outlive the conquerors. Historians still argue whether these subtle hacks of resistance often call everyday resistance, or cultural survival count as rebellion. But that's the injustice, how easily the quietest courage gets dismissed. Because we've been taught to look for revolution in the dramatic, fire, nose, blood, but real defiance, it often looks like someone carrying on. Take enslaved people in the Americas who faked illness to rest their bodies, who broke tools, who sang in code, who taught forbidden languages in whispers behind the barn, each act a tiny rebellion, invisible to the plantation ledgers but not to each other. Or consider the women of occupied Korea, secretly teaching their children Hangul, while official schools pushed Japanese. They weren't soldiers, but they were warriors of memory. A fringe tidbit. In Nazi-occupied France, some librarians risked death by hiding banned books behind false shelves. Some even copied them by hand, page after page. No guns, just ink, dust wool. And in colonial India, farmers grew native crops the British didn't want, not because they were profitable, but because they remembered the taste of home. Sometimes survival is resistance. You see it in hairstyles, in lullabies, in embroidery patterns, in rice varieties smuggled in braids, in the festival that looks like a party, but carries the memory of something once outlawed. Even architecture can speak rebellion. Mud huts shaped like lost temples, round doors carved in honor of ancestors the empire tried to erase. And what of language? So many colonized people were told, speak properly, speak correctly, but they didn't, not entirely. They invented new dialects, blended tongues, created creoles and pidgins and patois, languages born in chains but spoken in freedom. Even laughter can resist, satire, folk tales that mock the king, puppets that act out parables with suspiciously familiar tyrants. You laugh quietly, and that, too, is dangerous, because power hates being laughed at, especially by the people that thought it had broken. And yet, these rebellions rarely make the record. They're too small, too personal, too insignificant. No declarations, no flags, just a woman baking bread and a band shape, a boy carving a forbidden symbol into the underside of a desk, a song hummed in a language the officials don't recognize but your grandmother would. You start to realize something. These quiet acts weren't just survival. They were futures. Each defiant word, each forbidden seed, each stitched pattern was a promise. You will not erase me. I will outlast you. And they did. We still eat those dishes, speak those phrases, wear those designs, not knowing, perhaps, that someone once risked everything to keep them alive. Even rest can be resistance. In a system that demands your constant labor, taking a nap is a rebellion, letting your body soften, letting your mind drift, refusing to grind yourself down for someone else's profit. So if you've ever slowed down when the world told you to hurry, if you've ever laughed when you were supposed to stay serious, if you've ever held on to something strange and beautiful and yours, even when it didn't fit, you've joined the quiet resistance. History might not remember it, but your bones will. Tonight, think of the ones who fought back by holding on, by staying kind, by keeping secrets, by planting something, by singing under their breath. No parades, no monuments, just truth stitched into the seams of ordinary life. You're near the end now. You've walked across centuries of silence, stumbled through dust and data, stared down forgotten faces. But one last thing remains, not a date, not a battle. A question, who tells the end? Because every history book has to stop somewhere. Every documentary cuts to credits. Every statue eventually cracks. But the story keeps breathing. And the final injustice is this: we're still letting the wrong people write the last line. Even now, in classrooms and courts, in museums and media, we give the mic to the same kinds of voices, wealthy, literate, often male, often from the places that colonized, not the ones that were colonized. They don't mean to distort things, sometimes they do, but often it's just habit, momentum, a bookshelf full of the same perspective. Historians still argue whether true objectivity in history is even possible. But maybe that's the wrong goal. Maybe what we need isn't neutrality, it's multiplicity. More voices, more lenses, more truth, because the truth is rarely clean. It's messy, complicated, contradictory, and often history has been flattened for convenience, simplified for textbooks, Disneyfied for tourists. You see it in the timeline of progress, the illusion that things always get better, that we're smarter now, kinder now, that the past was just a warm-up act for the present. But the present still forgets, still distorts, still punishes, still silences. Take climate history. We frame it like a new crisis. But ask the people of the Sahel or the Pacific Islands or the Dust Bowl farmers. They've been watching the skies for generations. Their stories are survival guides but rarely quoted in policy briefings. Or think about justice movements. We talk about abolition, civil rights, suffrage as if they were one-time victories, but they're not past tense. They're processes, still going, still unfinished, and as you lie here, blinking into the dark, you realize something gently radical. The story hasn't ended, and yes, you are part of its authorship. Maybe not in ink, maybe not in headlines, but in how you listen, how you remember, how you decide which stories to pass down. A friend's thought to tuck under your pillow. In Bori culture, history isn't something you look back at. It's something that walks behind you, always present, always whispering. You don't escape it, you carry it forward. So the real question isn't what happened, it's what will you do with what happened. You've seen the missing names, the edited truths, the systems polished to look like justice. You've heard the laughter in dark places, the lullabies that outlive empires, the footsteps of children who never made it to the final chapter. You carry them now, not with guilt, with grace. Because remembering is not about perfection, it's about care. So when someone tells you a story, especially a loud one, a shiny one, a version polished and framed, ask, who benefits from this version? Who's missing? What questions weren't asked? And then, maybe, go looking for them in a forgotten cookbook, in a gravestone with no name, in the way your grandmother folded cloth, in the rhythm of a prayer no one else recognizes, in the eyes of someone who's never been asked for their version of the story. Because history isn't over, it never was. And maybe the most just thing you can do is stay awake long enough to remember that.